Let us continue with the second turning of the tide, the turning of the global monetary architecture. We're writing about the de-dollarization for a couple of years now, and it's also a big chapter in this year's report. Our mutual friend Grant Williams, he said in this fabulous documentary, Gold, the Story of Man's 6,000-year obsession, probably one of the best documentaries ever made on gold. Grant said, while the dollar has been the world's reserve currency for 40 years, that hasn't always been the case. The British pound, the Spanish peseta, and even the Portuguese escudo at one point in history were all as mighty in their time as the dollar is today. Throughout history, when civilizations needed to finance expansion, they were constrained by their gold reserves. Now, of course, I think this de-dollarization that we're seeing at the moment is also, first of all, a consequence of, the dollar being the world's reserve currency since the Bretton Woods Agreement. But also, I think this movement, this questioning of this privilege is also a consequence of the fiscal situation that the US is in. And this is just a very basic debt chart. And we were quite astonished, actually, to study the analysis of the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, because they see 14 trillion further deficits for the US in the next 10 years. But under the kind of naive or very optimistic assumption that there will be no recession at all in the next 10 years. So probably the projected deficit should be significantly higher in the US. Now, let's come to this chart that is kind of telling us, kind of showing us what we're seeing, this U-turn when it comes to central bank gold reserves. And we can see that developed markets, basically they at least stopped selling their gold reserves, while the rest of the world, especially emerging market countries, they are pretty aggressively buying gold at the moment. And this is something that we can see on this chart. Now, Jim, I know this is a very, very important topic for you. You're also talking about the axis of gold. We're seeing China, Russia, Turkey, India, but also Iran, countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, aggressively buying physical gold. Jim, what's the longer term strategy regarding official gold reserves in those emerging countries, and what does it have to do with the de-dollarization?
Great question, Ronnie, and probably one of the most important monetary or geopolitical questions in the world today. So there are two things going on at once. They're related, but you can sort of analyze them separately and then bring them together. The first is what you referred to, which is a shift in the basis of the global international monetary system. Some people refer to this as a reset, or the big reset, or global monetary reset. I go back to a much older description of it called the rules of the game. That phrase, the rules of the game, goes back at least 100 years, maybe further. But it's how the monetary elites themselves refer to or understand how the monetary system works. They call it the rules of the game, and everyone's supposed to know what they are. They're not written down. It's not a treaty. It's just how the system operates. The problem today, and I've had a couple of conversations with this one with, I mentioned Ben Bernanke, but also had a very long one-on-one conversation with John Lipsky. John is not nearly as well known as Bernanke or Janet Yellen or Jay Powell for that matter, but he is in the super elite category. John was the only American ever to head the IMF. And if you know the history there, when the IMF was established at Bretton Woods in 1944, and then it took them a couple of years to set it up, the Europeans were concern that the U.S. had too much power. Obviously, the U.S. got pretty much everything it wanted at Bretton Woods. We were on a dollar gold standard, and all the other currencies were not technically linked to gold. They were linked to the dollar, and then the dollar was linked to gold. So you had an indirect linkage to gold, but you could devalue against the dollar. The one thing that was not supposed to happen was the dollar would devalue against gold, although, of course, eventually it did. But the point being, there was so much power concentrated in the U.S. that the Europeans said, well, we don't think an American should be the head of the IMF. You guys have too much power. And America agreed. So the deal was that an American would always head the World Bank, but a non-American, specifically European and mostly French, would always head the IMF. And that's been true ever since, with one exception, which is our friend, in 2011, our friend Dominique Strauss-Kahn got arrested on various sexual assault charges by the NYPD, hauled off an Air France plane at JFK Airport. And the IMF had to resign a few days later, and the IMF executive board was literally not ready with a replacement. They didn't think they had to choose anyone. They eventually settled on Christine Lagarde. But John was the first deputy managing director at the time, the second most powerful position, and the highest one held by an American. So he had to step up as acting managing director of the IMF, in effect, the head of the IMF. So the only American ever hold that position. I had a very long, over an hour one-on-one conversation with him in Hong Kong just a couple of weeks ago. Fascinating. But he agrees that the system is incoherent. In fact, he used that word, that there is no anchor, that we've got all these floating exchange rates, but everything can be described in reference to something else, some other form of money, but nothing can be described in reference to an objective standard. And of course, that's always the role that gold has performed. So I can talk about the euro-dollar cross rate, or I can talk about the yuan-dollar cross rate, or any other cross rate I want, but I have no basis for assessing any currency in terms of something that's not another currency. And so, as I said, there's no anchor. And, we're supposed to have this, the euro is supposed to be a store of value. The dollar is supposed to be a store of value. If you look at the time series of the euro-US dollar cross rate since 1999, when the euro was launched, you've had 6 swings of 20% or more in both directions. The euro's gone from 80 cents to $1.60. Then went down to $1.30, back up to $1.45, down to 105, back up to 119. What is that? These are the two most important currencies in the world. They're supposed to represent stores of value, and yet they're swinging back and forth in very, very large magnitudes. That's not any kind of stable system at all. And so that's what we have today. So the Chinese realize this, the Russians realize this, others realize it. They're saying, okay, what can we do to create stability? And of course, you just turn to gold, because gold has, we don't have to belabor the point, gold has all the attributes that we understand very well, and it is a secure anchor for monetary system. So that's one thing going on, and that's what you're seeing in these charts. But the other thing is geopolitical, which is the U.S. is using and maybe even abusing the status of the dollar. Now, just to be clear, the dollar is approximately 60% of global reserves, 80% of global payments, and almost 100% of oil pricing. So there's no doubt that the dollar dominates the international monetary system. And that would be by itself cause for resentment in places like China and Russia that are trying to get out from under what I call U.S. dollar hegemony. But it's worse than that, because the U.S. is using this status to impose economic sanctions on Russia, China, and other countries around the world. Now, how do we do this? Well, the first thing we've done this to Iran. We eased up during the last couple of years of the Obama administration. Now it's back. We're putting what the White House refers to as maximum pressure on Iran, maximum pressure on North Korea, and we're putting some substantial pressure, if not maximum pressure, on Russia and China and others. Now, the list of grievances is long. In the case of Russia, it's for taking Crimea and interfering in eastern Ukraine, and probably some of these assassinations in the UK. In the case of China, it's theft of intellectual property and cyber warfare. In the case of Iran, it's their nuclear program. Same thing with North Korea, threats to Israel. So the U.S. has, geopolitical reasons. Notice all the things I just mentioned are not monetary. They're geopolitical. But we're using monetary weapons. This is financial war. We are in a war. We, the United States, are in a war with Russia. We're in a war with Iran. We're in a war with North Korea and China today, as we speak. It's not a kinetic war. It's not a shooting war. It's a financial war. I'm not talking about the trade war. Trade war is a whole separate subject. We could spend a couple hours on that. This is a financial war. So the first thing we do, we cut you out of the U.S. dollar payment system. You could be your entire country in the case of Iran, or it could be specific companies and specific individuals in the case of Russia and China. So we say you can't use the dollar payment system, which we completely control. If you want to pay me in dollars, or if China wants to pay Iran in dollars for its oil, I guarantee those dollars at some point flow through U.S. banks and flow through something called the Fedwire or the New York Clearinghouse, and that is controlled ultimately by the Treasury and the Fed. That's the first thing we do. The second thing we do, if we want to play rough, is we de-SWIFT you. And of course, SWIFT is the Belgian-based international financial telecommunications network that handles all payments between countries in all the major currencies. So if Deutsche Bank wants to settle a euro transaction with Citibank, that goes through SWIFT. If Unicredit in Italy wants to settle, could be Swiss francs with UBS, that goes through SWIFT. So we kicked Iran out of SWIFT in 2012 and then into 2013. And that's like cutting off the oxygen supply to a patient in intensive care. They die pretty quickly. We're now, we haven't de-SWIFTed Iran, but we're doing what are called secondary boycotts, which are saying, okay, you can do business with Iran, but if you do, you can't do business in the United States. So even though the leaders of Europe, even though the other members of the G5 plus one, or the United Nations Security Council 5+1, which is Germany, except for the United States, want to continue to do business in Iran. The companies are not going along with the leadership because they're afraid of sanctions in the U.S., and they should be. And then same thing with China. We're throwing on these Section 301 tariffs for theft of intellectual property. So the whole world is watching this. They're saying, okay, not only does the dollar dominate, which we don't like to begin with, but you're throwing your weight around. You're like a bully who shows up on the playground and just beats up all the other kids. What happens in that situation? Well, you can beat up kids one by one, but eventually the kids form a gang and they come back and they beat up the bully. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran. You've got India in your charts, which is very interesting. Iran is not transparent. We don't know how much gold Iran has. We do know that they've been getting as much as they can, as fast as they can. Some of it because Obama sent some pallets of gold in a plane to Iran as part of the payoff for entering this joint comprehensive plan of agreement on the nuclear portfolio. But a lot of gold has come into Iran, transshipped through Dubai originally and later through Turkey, and Turkey's in this club. So China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are what I call the new axis of gold. They are preparing for a non-dollar world. Mm-hmm. And they know that their local currencies are not going to be global reserve currencies. The Chinese yuan is the best of the lot, and that's at least 10 years away. And there's a lot of infrastructure you need. You can't just wake up and be a global reserve currency. You need a bond market. You need repos. You need dealers. You need hedging tools. You need futures, options, etc. Yep. Plus, above all, you need the rule of law, which they don't have. But the IMF SDR, which we can come back to, and gold itself are suitable candidates for a global reserve. So that's exactly what we're saying. So it has a financial aspect, which is predicting the demise of the dollar because of excessive U.S. dollar debt, which we cannot get out of. That is a roach motel. We're going to have to inflate or default. And the geopolitical aspect, which is they're sick of the U.S. Pushing them around using the dollar payment system. So this is a very big deal.
Yeah, just one number. I think in the first quarter, Iran's gold demand more than tripled. So there's definitely quite a lot going on. This chart is also fascinating, and I think it refers to something that Charles Garth just recently said on Macro Voices. I thought it was a fascinating statement. He said, you have to understand that the gold price is now a big play between the US and China. So to a certain extent, the price of gold is going to tell you who is going to win in that effort to de-dollarize Asia. If gold goes up, it's China. If gold goes down, it is the US. Now, what we have done in the report together with Luke Roman is we had a look at the biggest oil net exporters, and their trading deals, their supply deals, the oil supply deals, and their pricing. And I think it's really fascinating to see how many agreements already have been made between China and many important oil exporters. Just as some sort of anecdotal evidence, I just attended the World Mining Congress. I was a keynote speaker at the World Mining Congress in Kazakhstan, in Astana. Absolutely fascinating city. It feels a bit like, I don't know, a combination of Singapore and New York and Las Vegas. Really, you wouldn't expect such a city in Kazakhstan. And at this Congress, it was really big, more than 3,000 delegates. I think I didn't see any US American, but I would say like 60 or 70% of the delegates and attendants were Chinese, and from what I could tell, talking to a minister from Kazakhstan as well, the One Belt, One Road is really a huge project, a project that will probably be around for the next couple of decades. But really having, the foot on the ground, you can tell that this de-dollarization is actually happening already. And I think this table confirms that pretty well.